Hello. I don't have an intro for this channel yet. It's my very first video. But anyways, welcome to a 16-year-old talking about history topics, despite the fact that literally last week she just got out of school and finished her A-Push class, which is the last true history class that I need to take in high school. I make smart decisions. Anyways, am I prepared to be making this video, and do I know what I am doing? Absolutely. No. I am not prepared to make this video, but I promised myself that I would make this YouTube video before I went on a trip in 2 days, and now I'm forcing myself in front of the camera. Please bear with me. Alright, now that intro is out of the way, let's get into why I'm here, what I'm doing with this video. This is definitely going to be a series where I'm going to take a story from some specific media, mainly it's probably going to be a movie or a TV show, something like that. And then I'm going to briefly, go through the plot for anybody that maybe hasn't seen it or they just haven't seen it in a while. I'm talking about a movie that came out around a decade ago, so but I definitely recommend going and watching whatever I'm talking about first. And then I'm going to explain whatever historical event that media features. So everything that I pick out, there's going to be some sort of specific either historical event or historical figure that it talks about, and then I'm going to go into that story. So in this case, X-Men First Class features the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I'm going to briefly explain the plot of that movie, and then I'm going to go into the real story behind the Cuban Missile Crisis. These videos aren't going to necessarily be to critique how historically accurate it is, or go into that necessarily, or like specifics with that. It's more just give an overall jumping off point to talk about these interesting historical topics or people. As a quick disclaimer here, I am a 16-year-old high school student, and obviously I do as much research as I can, and a lot of the topics that I'm talking about is stuff that I've, my teachers have explained to me, and I've had, lectures about, or just taken notes or looked through the history textbook about them. But I don't know everything. I obviously also try to find the most credible sources that I can. But also please feel free to correct me in the comments if I get anything wrong. I'm not a teacher. I don't have a degree in this or anything. I'd like to get a degree. We'll see. Anyways, let's get into X-Men First Class. Alright, spoilers for X-Men First Class ahead. Obviously, I'm talking about the entire movie here. Anyways, this is a prequel film that explains how the X-Men got together, mainly following Charles Xavier, aka Professor X, and Eric Lenscher, aka Magneto. Hopefully if you're watching this video, you know who these people are. But Charles is a telepath, Eric can control metal, and they're all going against the main villain, Sebastian Shaw, who is basically a walking nuclear bomb, and he decides that all of humanity needs to die, and that the growing X-Men want to stop him from doing that. Also with the idea that if they help to stop Shaw, if all mutants are shown to society and most humans become aware of their existence, that hopefully they'll be viewed in a more favorable light if their first intro into the world is by stopping a major, basically, supervillain. This is where we get into the main historical topic that we're going to be discussing here, the Cuban Missile Crisis, because Shaw's whole plan is to just start the Cuban Missile Crisis. He gets missiles placed in Turkey and missiles to be sent to Cuba. And as the Soviet ship is approaching the embargo line in Cuba, by the way, they call this a blockade, like the Americans are blockading Cuba. That's incorrect. It's one of the major inaccuracies that I noticed in this movie, just right off the bat. I'll obviously explain it more later. It's interesting because I only need to really change one word to make it right. But as the Soviet ship approaches the embargo line, they get orders for that ship to stop. However, Shaw has made sure that that cannot happen and has killed everyone on the ship, which leads to more mutant stuff happening that's changing what actually happened in real life, as Charles uses his mind control powers to make one of the Soviet officers blow up the incoming ship with all of the missiles on it, preventing war between the two nations. However, Shaw wants to just start war in another way, and the X-Men know that they can't let that happen. leading to a very epic scene where Eric lifts an entire submarine out of the water, and there's just a big fight, mainly with just the mutants and humans being confused about what's going on, and Eric murders Shaw. Fully justified. Charles gets mad at him, but Eric is fully in the right to kill Shaw. Shaw is a horrible person. Let Eric commit some murder, okay? He deserves it. He's been through a lot, okay? Anyways. They're on a beach after they've defeated Shaw and everything should be fine, but now the main governments, the United States and the USSR, decide that the mutants are too big of a threat and they try to kill them by sending all of the missiles that they were going to fire at each other and fire them all at the mutants. But again, they have a guy that can control metal on their team, so Eric just stops all of the missiles in midair. Now Eric wants to turn them all back and kill all of the humans that are on these ships that decide to fire on them. Charles tries to convince him that this is a bad idea, though he does the absolute worst job at doing it possible and doesn't manage to convince Eric. Instead, the two of them get to a fight with each other that ends when the main CIA agent tries to shoot and kill Eric. That doesn't work because the bullets are metal and Eric can control metal. But the main fight ends because one of the bullets gets sent off and hits Charles in the spine, which is how he gets paralyzed and why we mainly see him in a wheelchair. That's basically the entire plot of this movie. Most of humanity doesn't actually end up figuring out about mutants this way because a lot of it, is like classified by the government. And also Charles erases the main human there, Maura McTaggart's. He erases her memory, so she cannot tell anyone in the CIA about what happened. Alright, it's time for a history lesson. Let's get into the real-world events of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, these 2 weeks are the closest that the world has ever come to nuclear war. And pretty much everyone was essentially afraid for their lives as to what would happen if something went wrong here. So how did we get to this point? This story all the way is going to start in World War II, as even though the USSR and the United States were allies with each other, they really didn't like each other because their ideologies were so fundamentally different from each other, notably their economic and political systems, with the USSR being communist, the US being capitalist, the USSR had an authoritarian government, the United States had a democracy. They didn't like each other, but they couldn't go to war with each other about it because they both had nuclear weapons. That type of thinking is known as MAD, or mutually assured destruction. They knew that the two of them couldn't fight with each other, so they found solutions around it. Mainly finding allies with smaller nations that share their similar ideas that could basically go to war for them with other smaller nations. Notable for this story is that the United States sent missiles to Turkey, which is notable because it is very close to the USSR. And then later, when Cuba became a communist nation, again, Cuba is very close to the coast of Florida, they allied themselves with the USSR. Also, this is after a very failed invasion attempt from the United States, known as the Bay and Pigs invasion. Just there. The USSR agreed to send Cuba their own missiles. Now, when an American U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba and saw construction that was meant for the incoming missiles, the United States knew that they needed to do something about it, as the Soviet ship carrying these missiles got closer and closer to Cuba. Which is why President Kennedy agreed to place a quarantine around the island. Now, I briefly mentioned this when I was explaining the plot of First Class. In First Class, they say that there is a blockade around the island. That's kind of incorrect. It was very specific that the word blockade was not used when referring to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because a blockade is very an intentional act of war and could have just started a war outright. However, quarantine has a different meaning to it. It's pretty subtle, but basically a quarantine means more of just blocking military supplies, and a blockade just blocks everything from coming in. Now, as the Soviet ship got closer, there were attempts at diplomacy being made between the two nations. However, a lot of them were doing well, and a lot of them were also very secretive. However, in a meeting between the president's brother, Robert Kennedy, and a Soviet ambassador, they came to an agreement. If the United States took their missiles out of Turkey, the Soviet Union would take their missiles out of Cuba. And at pretty much the last minute, as the rest of the world was prepared for war, the Soviet ship carrying the missiles turned around, and basically everyone went home. Now again, nothing happened. Nobody really died. I mean, Cuba was kind of upset that they didn't get their missiles, but it's a pretty small price for the safety of the rest of the world. But everyone really began to realize that this couldn't go on. And slowly after this point, generally tensions between the Cold War would go down. It wouldn't be a, straight decline or anything. There's definitely other events that would increase tensions, but it never got to this point again. And that process of it sort of slowly going down and peace seeming more and more achievable, the Cold War officially ended in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And that's it for our history lesson part, but let's get into some other interesting facts about this movie and the Cuban Missile Crisis and their connection with each other. Alright, time for some final analysis about these two connecting to each other. I might actually have more to say in this part in later videos, because really this is just a direct one-on-one comparison here. First class is essentially just taking the Cuban Missile Crisis and throwing in superheroes. Which, out of all historical events that you could do this for, the Cuban Missile Crisis is definitely an interesting place to throw superheroes into, considering how tense of a situation it is, but also really is a way for the heroes to show off their heroism and what great things they can do for humanity, while also terrifying the rest of humanity as to what they are capable of. But also, I don't really have that much else to say here. I will say that there's other historical things you can get into from this movie. Maybe I can go back and revisit this, or just go watch the movie yourself and check some stuff out. Notably, a couple of notable ones that stood out for me is a lot of stuff involving Eric and his story. He's really my favorite character in this movie, and I think also probably the most well-written. For example, he goes to Argentina to go hunt down Nazis that escaped justice, which again is fully real. This is stuff that actually happened. Or even him going to a French bank with a bar of gold that the Nazis had that were taken from basically their victims from like their possessions. It really highlights that like these superhero movies, and the reason why I really like these X-Men movies, they do manage to get into actual topics and like serious topics. Overall, this is what the X-Men are good at. The X-Men is a lens that you can look at actual real life struggles and real life events, which is why I like this movie so much. I like that it's not afraid to, have one of the second opening shots being Eric's backstory with the Holocaust. I like that it's taking real world events. I like that it's drawing parallels between their characters and real world struggles. I really find that the X-Men movies, at least in my opinion, these movies, they sometimes have more meaning than a lot of MCU movies do. And I have different opinions. I'm not the hugest fan of, Dark Phoenix, but I really like this movie. And maybe I'll get another opportunity to go more in depth into other topics in the future. Okay, this is all that I have to say on this topic here. But seriously, if you've watched this far in the video, thank you so much. Making this YouTube channel is something that I've been wanting to do for a really long time, and I'm just really happy that I've actually managed to sit down and do it. Just thank you. Go follow me on my Instagram account I have for this channel at PocketWatchAcademic. Again, thank you for watching my channel. Hopefully I will get a better outro soon, but that's it for now. Also in the next video, I have some other ideas for the series, and then other ideas that I have for just varied topics. Obviously all pretty educational in nature, other history and other media, a lot of literature-based stuff coming up. Cool, bye!